My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the president of Burkina Faso. What I am about to say is true as I experienced it, but I do not tell it to accuse anyone. I tell it because silence would be more dangerous. I tell it so that no one repeats what should never be repeated. Some stories are not political. They are moral warnings. This is one of them. That night, our capital did not sleep. Not because of celebration, not because of victory. It stayed awake because order had thinned and anger had learned to shout louder than reason. From a distance, I heard broken chants drifting through the streets, mixed with the sharp sound of metal striking stone, glass shattering, and the burning smell of smoke pressing into the lungs. What began as a protest had lost its name. It was no longer guided by ideas. It had become movement without conscience. I was standing not far from the square. Under streetlights that flickered as if they themselves were uncertain, there stood a statue of Jesus Christ. It had stood there for decades, quietly watching generations pass. It had seen governments rise and fall. It had seen poverty, hope, failure, and prayer. It had harmed no one. That night, 7 men walked toward it without words. There were no slogans anymore, no demands, only raw, anonymous rage. The first strike landed, then another. The sound of stone cracking was dry and final, a sound that does not echo because it does not need to. I watched as the head of the statue broke free, fell to the ground, rolled slightly, and came to rest facing the night sky. In that moment, the square went unnaturally silent, not because it was Jesus, but because a boundary had been crossed. A sacred line that once broken cannot simply be redrawn. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph, only hollow faces, confused by what their own hands had done. A heavy feeling settled over everything, as if something deeper than politics, deeper than power, had been violated. When I understood fully what had happened, I ordered the military to detain all 7 men and place them in separate holding for investigation. Even then, I knew this was no longer a security issue. It was a crisis of the soul of a nation. And that is when the ending began. A sequence of events that shocked me. After the night of the riot, nothing dramatic happened in the way people expect when they speak of sacrilege. There was no thunder tearing the sky open, no fire falling from above, no voice speaking from the clouds. If that is what you are waiting for, you will always miss how truth actually moves. What followed was quieter, slower, more unsettling. It began with reports from the soldiers guarding the holding area where the 7 men were kept. These were not young recruits prone to superstition. These were men who had stood watch in real war zones, men who had seen death without blinking. When they asked to speak to me privately, I knew something was wrong. They did not speak of violence. They did not speak of escape attempts. They spoke of unease. One guard told me the air in the corridor felt heavy, as if breathing required intention. Another said time seemed distorted during his shifts, minutes stretching without explanation. None of them used religious language. They struggled to find words at all. I listened carefully and said nothing. I ordered medical evaluations. I ordered psychological screenings. I wanted facts, not rumors. Burkina Faso is not governed by whispers. Yet even as reports came back clean, the testimonies did not stop. One soldier said he heard weeping late at night, not loud, not theatrical, but restrained, as if someone were trying not to be heard. When he approached the cell, the prisoner inside was silent, sitting upright, eyes open, hands clenched, tears already dry on his face. Another guard told me something that still troubles me. He said that when he walked past the cells, he felt watched, not by the prisoners, but by the absence between them, as if something invisible had entered the space and refused to leave. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because leadership demands honesty, especially when events do not fit our preferred explanations. I went myself. I did not go as a commander. I went as a man responsible for what had happened under my watch. I walked the corridor slowly. The walls were clean. The floor was clean. Everything was ordinary, except the silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that follows a question no one wants to answer. The 7 men were separated, each in his own cell. None of them spoke when they saw me. Not out of defiance, out of something closer to confusion. They looked like men who had woken up somewhere unfamiliar, inside their own bodies. I realized then that whatever was unfolding did not belong to the language of punishment. This was not fear of the state. This was not regret over arrest. This was disorientation at a deeper level. They had not been cursed. They had been confronted. We often imagine guilt as something loud, something that shouts. But true guilt is quiet. It does not accuse. It waits. It sits beside you and refuses to leave. I thought of something I learned long before politics entered my life. That when a person destroys what is sacred, the consequence is rarely external. it is internal. The fracture happens inside, where no courtroom can reach. That night, standing in that corridor, I understood something that changed how I see authority. Power can restrain bodies. Only conscience restrains souls. What those men were experiencing had nothing to do with religion as an institution. It had everything to do with reverence, or the lack of it. They had not struck stone alone. They had struck a meaning that did not belong to them. And meaning, once wounded, responds in ways that law cannot predict. I left the holding area without speaking to the men. Not because I had nothing to say, but because words would have interfered with what was already unfolding. This was no longer my process to control. It was a reckoning that had begun quietly, invisibly, and without witnesses. And it was only the beginning. The first man was the one who held the hammer. He was not the loudest that night. He was not the one who shouted slogans or stirred the crowd. He acted without words. When the moment came, he stepped forward and struck first. That detail matters. Violence always begins with someone willing to move before thought catches up. When I asked to see him, the medical team warned me in advance. They said there was nothing clinically wrong with him. No fractures, no nerve damage, no neurological injury. His brain scans were clean. His blood work showed nothing abnormal. Yet his right hand no longer obeyed him. It was not paralyzed. It was not injured. It simply refused cooperation. When he sat across from me, he kept that hand close to his body, fingers curled inward as if holding something invisible. I asked him to lift it. Slowly, with effort, he raised it halfway, and then it began to shake. Not violently, not dramatically. It trembled the way a person trembles when standing before something they regret but cannot undo. He looked at his own hand with fear, not pain. He told me quietly that it did not hurt. He told me it did not feel numb. It felt alive but no longer loyal. The doctors had already tried everything. Medication, physical therapy, tests repeated until repetition itself became meaningless. There was no explanation that satisfied science. Then came the detail that unsettled them. Every day, without fail, the hand would slowly close on its own, not suddenly, not spasmodically, gradually, as if completing a decision made elsewhere. The fingers would press into the palm until the skin broke and blood appeared. He did not scream when this happened, he only watched. When nurses tried to pry the fingers open, the resistance was firm but not rigid. It was the resistance of intention, not muscle. I asked him a simple question. I asked him what he felt at the moment the statue broke. He did not answer immediately. When he did speak, his voice was flat. He said that at first he felt powerful, not strong, powerful. He said there was a moment when the crowd seemed to disappear and it was just him and the object in front of him. Then the head fell. He said that was when the feeling left. Not guilt, emptiness. He told me something else, something he had not told the doctors. He said that every time his hand began to close, he remembered the sound of stone cracking. Not the sound itself, but what followed it. The silence. He said the hand tightened most when he tried to justify what he had done. When he told himself it was only a statue. When he tried to laugh it away. When he tried to turn it into politics. But when he sat alone at night and whispered a simple sentence, the tightening slowed. The sentence was not a prayer he had learned as a child. It was not theological. It was human. I should not have done that. That was all. I did not speak to him of punishment. I did not mention law. I did not threaten consequences. Those things were already irrelevant. I left that room understanding something that no academy teaches. That the body sometimes becomes the courtroom when the mind refuses to hold trial. He had used his hand to break what generations had respected. Now his hand reminded him of that choice every single day. Not as revenge, as memory. The second man never touched the statue. That is what he kept telling everyone. He did not lift a hammer. He did not throw a stone. He stood a few steps back and shouted. He urged others forward. He fed the crowd the words it needed to move faster than thought. Do it, he yelled. Break it. He believed distance would protect him. When I was informed that he had lost his voice, my first reaction was practical. Tear gas can damage the throat. Stress can affect speech. Fear can silence people temporarily. None of this would have surprised me. But this was not that. He was not mute. His vocal cords were intact. He could breathe normally. He could swallow. There was no swelling, no infection, no injury. Yet when he tried to speak with anger, nothing came out but a thin whisper, like air escaping through a crack in a door. The doctors tested him repeatedly. They asked him to shout. They asked him to argue. They asked him to curse. Each time his mouth opened, his body prepared to project sound, and only a faint breath emerged. It was not weakness. It was refusal. I asked to see him. When I entered the room, he tried to speak immediately. I could see the urgency in his eyes. He wanted to explain himself before I could define him. That instinct alone told me much about his character. The sound that came out was barely audible. I asked him to slow down. I asked him to speak only when he could hear his own voice. He shook his head in frustration. Then something happened that no one in that room expected. As he struggled, his shoulders dropped, his face changed. He stopped trying to argue and instead looked down at his hands. His lips moved again, but this time with no urgency. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words were clear, not loud. The room went still. The doctor looked at me. I looked at the man. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. Again, he whispered an apology. Again, his voice came through, fragile but intact. I asked him to say something else. Anything. He tried to accuse the police. His voice vanished. He tried to defend himself. Nothing. Then, almost experimentally, I asked him to speak as if he were alone, speaking to no one but himself. His voice returned. Not strong, not confident, but real. That was when I understood. His voice had not been taken from him. It had been narrowed. It only passed through truth. The moment his words carried manipulation, incitement, or self-deception, they collapsed into silence. He began to cry then, not loudly, quietly. The kind of crying that happens when a person realizes that the tools they trusted most no longer serve them. He told me that all his life, words had been his strength. He could stir people. He could provoke reactions. He could escape responsibility by staying just far enough from action. That night in the square, he thought he was safe. He thought only hands carried guilt. Now he understood something too late. That words can strike just as hard as hammers. That incitement is action, even when the hands remain clean. He asked me if his voice would ever return. I did not answer him directly. I told him something instead. I told him that speech is not a right without responsibility, that words are bridges between one conscience and another. When they are used to push others into destruction, they eventually collapse under their own weight. He nodded slowly. Before I left, he asked me one last question, barely audible. Why can I still apologize? I answered him honestly. Because remorse does not need volume. Because truth does not shout. Because the voice that builds can survive where the voice that destroys cannot. When I walked out of that room, I felt no satisfaction, only a heavy clarity. We speak often of freedom of expression. We speak less of the cost of expression without restraint. That man had not lost his voice. He had lost permission to misuse it. And that loss frightened him more than prison ever could. The remaining 5 men did not share the same affliction, but none of them escaped untouched. If justice were mechanical, their consequences would have looked identical. But conscience does not work like law. It adapts itself to the inner architecture of each person. It presses where resistance is weakest. It enters through the cracks already present. One of them laughed constantly. Not the laughter of humor. Not the laughter of defiance. It was a thin, repetitive sound that emerged without invitation. His face was soaked with tears, even as the laughter continued, as if 2 opposite reactions were trapped in the same body and neither could leave. The doctors called it incongruent affect, a mismatch between emotion and expression, a term meant to sound scientific enough to close the conversation. But when I asked him why he laughed, he did not answer with confusion. He answered with exhaustion. I laugh, he said, because if I stop, I will hear what I am trying not to hear. I asked him what that was. He closed his eyes and said nothing more. Another man sat on his bed for hours, rubbing his palms together. When guards searched his cell, they found grains of sand everywhere. On the floor, on the mattress, in the folds of his clothing. The cell had been cleaned. Repeatedly. There was no source. When questioned, he looked genuinely confused. He said the sand was not there to him. He said his hands felt heavy, as if they had been buried and dug up again. Later, one of the nurses told me that whenever this man tried to sleep, he jolted awake and brushed his hands violently, as though trying to remove something that was not visible. I thought of the square, of the ground beneath the fallen head of the statue, of how dust rises when stone breaks. Memory does not always return as images. Sometimes it returns as sensation. A third man spoke constantly, but never to anyone in the room. He mumbled fragments of sentences, unfinished thoughts, half-formed questions. When asked who he was speaking to, he grew agitated and refused to answer. But one night, a guard overheard him say something clearly. Why did you let me do it? That question haunted me, not because it blamed God, but because it revealed something human. We often look for permission to cross lines we already know exist. When no one stops us, we mistake silence for approval. The last two men were quieter. One refused to eat unless someone was watching him. Alone, he pushed food away. Under observation, he ate mechanically without appetite. When asked why, he said he needed someone to see him. He said being unseen felt dangerous. The other sat facing the wall for hours at a time, unmoving. When guards tried to redirect him, he resisted gently, like a child refusing to leave a place of comfort. When I spoke to him, he told me the wall was not empty. He said it was where the statue used to be. Not physically, but inside him. None of these men were diagnosed as insane. None were declared unfit to stand trial. None were pretending. Any trained observer could see that these were not performances. These were fractures. What struck me most was that none of them spoke about God directly. They did not describe visions. They did not speak of judgment. They did not invoke punishment. They spoke of imbalance, of something missing, of a quiet they could not escape. We often expect consequences to arrive with force. We imagine them as something imposed. But what I witnessed taught me something different. Sometimes consequences are simply the removal of inner coherence. When you violate what is sacred to others, you do not injure the sacred. You destabilize yourself. Because reverence is not about objects, it is about restraint. It is about knowing where to stop, even when anger invites you forward. Those 5 men had crossed a line together. Now each of them stood alone on the other side, carrying a weight no one had given them and no one could take away. Many believe the story ended with the 7 men. That is how we prefer our narratives: contained, measurable, punishment applied, lesson learned, order restored. But life rarely respects the boundaries we draw for it. The effects did not stop at the prison gates. They moved outward, quietly, into homes that had never touched the square that night. It began with the mothers. None of them were ill, none had been injured, none had been questioned by police. Yet one by one, they began to report the same thing, unaware of each other. They could no longer sleep. Not because of fear of arrest, not because of public shame, but because of dreams that returned night after night with the same unbearable clarity. In the dreams, their son stood alone in an empty square. No crowds, no shouting, no soldiers, just their child calling their name. And behind him, an absence, not rubble, not blood, an empty space where something had once stood. One mother asked to see me privately. She was not educated in politics or theology. She did not accuse the government. She did not demand justice. She cried softly and spoke with precision that surprised me. "I do not dream of Jesus," she said. "I dream of my failure. I dream that I did not teach my son when to stop." That sentence stayed with me. We often think of sin as rebellion against God, but sometimes it is simply the absence of guidance when guidance was needed most. Not hatred, but neglect. Not evil, but silence. Another mother said something similar. She told me she woke each night with the feeling that someone had called her, but when she opened her eyes, there was only the sound of her own breathing. She said the dreams were not frightening. They were humiliating, because in them, she knew exactly what should have been said years earlier, but had not been. The wives came later. They did not come together. They did not organize. They came alone, hesitant, ashamed to speak of things they could not explain. They told me their households had begun to unravel. Children fell ill without clear cause, fevers that came and went, weakness that resisted treatment. Doctors found nothing conclusive. Medicine helped briefly, then failed again. Work disappeared, contracts ended suddenly, opportunities that had seemed secure dissolved without confrontation, not dramatically, quietly. Food became scarce, debt grew, arguments multiplied. No one cursed them, no one threatened them, no authority intervened. Yet everything began to collapse. One woman asked me almost apologetically if the state was doing something to them, if they were being punished indirectly. I told her the truth. The state had done nothing. This was not retaliation. This was consequence without intention. I understood then something painful but necessary. Responsibility does not always stop at the individual, not because guilt spreads like infection, but because actions fracture environments. Families breathe the air their members poison. Children drink from wells their parents allow to be contaminated. This is not divine vengeance. It is moral physics. When a sacred boundary is shattered, the shock does not move upward toward God. It moves outward, through relationships, through trust, through stability. The families were not guilty, but they were affected. That distinction matters. Guilt accuses, consequence instructs, and the instruction was merciless in its clarity. An immoral act never belongs to one person alone. It waits. It travels. until someone, somewhere, decides to stop it. As these stories unfolded, I found myself changing, not as a politician. As a man, I had always believed leadership meant control, control of borders, control of weapons, control of narratives. I had been trained to think in terms of stability, security, and response. But standing at the center of this unfolding, I realized how shallow that definition was. Leadership is not only about preventing chaos, it is about guarding meaning before chaos becomes possible. That night in the square, the statue was not protected by law because it was stone. It was protected by an unspoken agreement that some things are not targets, even in anger. When that agreement failed, the law arrived too late. Silence, I learned, is not neutrality. Silence in the face of sacrilege is participation without fingerprints. I asked myself questions I had avoided before. Had we, as leaders, become so careful about offending that we forgot to protect what millions hold sacred? Had our fear of appearing authoritarian turned into permission for desecration? These were uncomfortable thoughts. But comfort has never been a reliable guide to truth. I began to speak with religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian, not to draft statements, not to perform unity, but to listen. What struck me was their agreement. None of them asked for violence. None demanded revenge. None called for punishment beyond the law. They asked for something much harder. They asked for respect. They asked for leaders who would draw clear lines and defend them calmly, without hysteria and without apology. One imam told me something I had not expected. He said, if they had broken a mosque, I would feel the same grief, because it is not the building that matters, it is what breaking it teaches the young. That sentence explained everything. Desecration educates. It teaches that nothing is beyond contempt. And when nothing is sacred, everything becomes disposable, including human life. I thought of the Sahel, of our fragile coexistence, of how quickly grievances are weaponized, of how easily religious symbols are used not to honor faith, but to provoke chaos. This was not a Christian issue. It was a human one. When a society loses its reverence, it does not become freer. It becomes unanchored. That is when extremism finds fertile ground, not in belief, but in the vacuum left by mockery and nihilism. I understood then why the consequences I had witnessed were so intimate, so internal. Because the real damage was not to a statue, it was to the moral immune system of the community. We can survive poverty. We can survive political failure. We can survive external pressure. But a society that laughs at what others hold sacred begins to rot from the inside. I do not say this to elevate religion above law. I say it because law without moral foundation becomes fragile, and fragile law invites violence. As president, I could issue decrees, I could increase patrols, I could condemn actions. But none of that would matter if we did not restore something quieter. Restraint. The willingness to stop ourselves before force stops us. That night taught me that leadership is not measured by how loudly one speaks, but by which lines one refuses to let be crossed. And by whether one is willing to speak before the stones are already broken. I returned to the 7 men one last time, not as an authority seeking confession, but as a witness trying to understand. By then, none of them asked about their sentences, none of them argued about fairness, none of them spoke of politics. Something far heavier had displaced those concerns. They had learned what many never do, that you cannot injure God. You can only injure your own peace. One of them said something that surprised me. He said he now understood why nothing dramatic had happened the moment the statue fell. No lightning, no fire, no divine spectacle. If something had happened immediately, he said, I would have blamed God. Now I have no one to blame but myself. That insight did not come from theology. It came from experience. They had expected punishment to arrive from outside. Instead, what left them was something far more precious. Inner calm, not all at once, not violently. It withdrew slowly, like light at the end of day, until they realized they were living in a kind of dusk they could not escape. One man told me he could no longer enjoy silence. Another said noise now frightened him. One confessed that prayer, which he had mocked, had become the only place where his thoughts stopped colliding. None of them spoke of visions, none claimed divine encounters, they spoke of absence. Peace had stepped away. I did not promise them relief. I did not offer absolution. That is not the role of the state. But I told them something they did not expect. I told them that conscience once awakened is painful, but it is also proof that something alive remains inside. A dead conscience feels nothing. They listened. For the first time since the riot, they were fully present. I left knowing that whatever sentence they served would be secondary to the sentence they already carried within themselves. This was not justice as spectacle. This was justice as awakening. The families asked me what lesson they were meant to learn. I told them the truth, even though it was difficult to hear. Families are not judged for the crimes of their members, but families shape the conditions in which restraint either grows or fails. Indifference is never neutral. It travels quietly across generations. A child who is never taught where to stop will eventually discover the boundary by breaking it. And broken boundaries leave scars that apology alone cannot erase. I told them that guilt is not inherited, but silence is learned. The mothers nodded, the wives wept, none of them argued. They had already understood. To my fellow leaders, especially in Africa and the Sahel, I say this without accusation. When political power collides with the sacred, it is no longer politics. It becomes a spiritual emergency. You can rewrite laws, you can suppress unrest, you can rebuild monuments, but no government has the authority to permit contempt for what millions hold holy. This does not mean enforcing belief. It means defending dignity. The dignity of faith, the dignity of restraint, the dignity of knowing that not everything should be tested simply because it can be. A nation does not collapse when statues fall. It collapses when mockery becomes policy and silence becomes permission. The most essential truth I learned is this: God does not need violence for defense, but society needs protection from learning to despise God. Because when human beings replace reverence with rage, something collapses long before religion does. It is the moral foundation of the self. Altars fall. Sacred words are mocked. Anger is mistaken for courage. And the first casualty is not faith. It is conscience. The statue was broken. Stone cracked. Dust settled. But the lesson remained. Those who touch what is sacred with hatred do not destroy the sacred. They create an emptiness inside themselves that no power can fill. Each morning I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory. Only vigilance. Only awakening. Or surrender. If these words have stirred reflection in you, do not rush past it, sit with it, speak about it, share it quietly with those who still listen. And if you wish to remain part of conversations that ask difficult questions without shouting, you know where to find us. As I bring this account to its close, I do so without triumph and without despair. I have learned that leadership is not proven by how many crises one survives, but by how deeply one allows those crises to change the way one sees the human soul. I have spoken as a president, but also as a witness. I have spoken to Muslims, to Christians, to leaders of the Sahel, and to those watching from far beyond Africa's borders. I speak especially to those who have lived long enough to know that history does not repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself quietly, through forgotten lessons and neglected boundaries. What happened that night was not about a statue alone. It was about what happens when anger forgets restraint, when grievance forgets dignity, when the sacred is treated as expendable because it does not belong to everyone equally. Jesus, whom many of you love and follow, taught without force. He corrected without humiliation. He warned without hatred. Those who claim to reject him often still live by standards shaped by his teaching, whether they admit it or not. Respect for the weak. Reverence for conscience. The refusal to reduce human beings to tools of rage. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this with sincerity. When a Christian symbol is desecrated, it is not Christianity alone that is wounded. It is the principle that faith deserves protection from contempt. Today it is a cross. Tomorrow it is a mosque. The day after, it is the human heart itself. To Christians, I say this gently. God does not need your fists. Christ does not need your vengeance. But the world does need your example of restraint, humility, and courage without cruelty. To leaders, I say this plainly. When we remain silent to avoid controversy, we do not preserve peace, we postpone reckoning, and the price of delay is always higher than the cost of clarity. To families, I say this with humility. Teach your children where to stop, not with fear, but with meaning, not with threats, but with reverence. The most dangerous inheritance is not poverty or hardship. It is indifference toward what should never be mocked. To the 7 men whose actions began this story, I do not speak condemnation. Life has already spoken to you more deeply than any court ever could. If you hear anything in these words, let it be this. Peace does not return through denial. It returns through acknowledgement, through humility, through the slow rebuilding of inner order. To the world watching Africa, often with judgment and impatience, I say this. We are not a continent without conscience. We are a continent learning, painfully, that modernization without moral grounding is not progress. It is acceleration toward collapse. I hope for a world where faith does not become a weapon and where disbelief does not become an excuse for contempt. I hope for Africa to rise without abandoning its soul. I hope for leaders who understand that power is temporary, but the damage done to conscience can last generations. I wish peace upon the elderly who still remember reverence. I wish clarity upon the young who are being taught that nothing matters. And I wish courage upon those who must speak before silence becomes betrayal. Each day, when I wake, I do not ask whether I will win, I ask whether I will remain awake. Because each day I must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender. If this reflection has reached you, take a moment before moving on. Speak about it with someone you trust. Leave a thought, not to argue but to reflect. And if you choose to follow these conversations as they continue, do so not for spectacle, but for understanding.